March 15th, 1948, 10:30 a.m. The Oval Office. J. Edgar Hoover sat across from President Harry Truman with another stack of reports. Thick manila folders stamped "Top Secret" in red ink. Soviet spies in the State Department. Communist agents in the Treasury. Atomic secrets being stolen and shipped to Moscow. Hoover had been delivering these warnings for 2 years. 2 years of meetings that followed the same pattern. Truman listened with visible skepticism. His jaw was tight. His eyes were cold. He didn't trust Hoover. Never had. The FBI director was a bureaucratic empire builder. He leaked selectively to friendly reporters. He cultivated relationships with conservative congressmen who hated Truman's policies. He collected dirt on politicians the way other men collected stamps. Everyone in Washington knew about Hoover's secret files. Everyone feared them. When Hoover finished his briefing, Truman's response was measured and dismissive. "Edgar, I've already established the Federal Employee Loyalty Program. Background checks are being conducted. Loyalty boards are investigating." Truman leaned forward. "But I need hard evidence, not suspicions, not associations, not someone who attended a Communist Party meeting in 1935. His voice hardened. "I need proof of actual espionage. Documents stolen, secrets passed, crimes committed." Hoover opened one of the folders. "Mr. President, we have reason to believe." "Reason to believe," Truman interrupted, "is not evidence." He stood up, signaling the meeting was over. "Bring me hard evidence, Edgar. Until then, I won't let this become a witch hunt." Hoover gathered his folders and left. His face was expressionless, but his hands gripped the files so tightly his knuckles were white. Truman sat back down and stared at the door Hoover had just walked through. He thought Hoover was exaggerating for political purposes, manufacturing a crisis to increase the FBI's power and budget. What Truman didn't know was that Hoover's reports were based on more than suspicion. They were backed by decoded Soviet intelligence cables that proved everything. And the decision to keep those cables secret from the president had been made by someone Truman trusted completely, Army Chief of Staff Omar Bradley. Bradley had the proof. Truman never saw it. February 1943. Arlington Hall Station, Virginia, a former girls' school, converted into the headquarters of the U.S. Army's Signals Intelligence Service. In a secure room on the second floor, dozens of cryptanalysts sat at desks covered with pages of encrypted Soviet cables. Rows and rows of seemingly random 5-digit number groups. The Soviets used what cryptographers called a one-time pad encryption system. Theoretically unbreakable if used correctly. Here's how it worked. Each page of ciphertext was used once, then destroyed. The encryption key was random. There were no patterns, no vulnerabilities, nothing for codebreakers to exploit. It was perfect cryptography, but it relied on one critical assumption: perfect execution by human beings. And human beings, even Soviet intelligence officers, make mistakes. During the chaos of World War II, Soviet cipher clerks were under enormous pressure. Thousands of messages needed to be encrypted and transmitted every week. Intelligence from American sources, orders from Moscow, reports from agents in the field. The workload was crushing. And so the Soviet cipher clerks did something that destroyed the security of their entire system. They reused pages from one-time pads. Not all the time, not obviously, but enough that American cryptanalysts began spotting patterns. A repeated phrase here, a statistical anomaly there, small vulnerabilities that could be exploited. The project was given a code name, Venona. December 20th, 1946. A brilliant cryptanalyst named Meredith Gardner sat at his desk at Arlington Hall, staring at a partially decrypted Soviet cable from 1944. He had been working on this particular message for months, substituting possible words, testing hypotheses, following patterns. And suddenly, there it was, a phrase that made his blood run cold. Enormous. The Soviet code name for the Manhattan Project. This wasn't diplomatic traffic. This was espionage. Gardner grabbed the phone. Within an hour, senior Army intelligence officers were standing over his desk. The cable discussed atomic secrets, technical data about bomb design, information that could only have come from someone inside the Manhattan Project. Over the next 3 years, Gardner's team would decrypt thousands of Soviet messages. What they found was staggering. The cables revealed massive espionage networks operating across America. Hundreds of Soviet agents, infiltration at the highest levels of government. The cables used code names instead of real names. Antenna was later identified as Julius Rosenberg. Liberal was David Greenglass. Ailes was Alger Hiss. Enormous was the Soviet operation targeting atomic secrets. By 1948, American intelligence had identified approximately 349 Americans who had covert relationships with Soviet intelligence agencies. 349. Soviet intelligence had penetrated the Manhattan Project, the State Department, the Treasury Department, the Office of Strategic Services, even the White House staff. For American counterintelligence, Venona was invaluable. It allowed the FBI to identify Soviet agents. It provided evidence for investigations. It revealed how Soviet intelligence networks operated. But there was one absolute, non-negotiable constraint. Venona could never be publicly acknowledged. Revealing it would tell the Soviets their codes had been broken. They would change their encryption systems. The intelligence stream would end. Knowledge of Venona was restricted to a tiny circle of people: Army intelligence, senior FBI counterintelligence officers, a handful of cryptanalysts, and that circle didn't include the President of the United States. February 1948. The Pentagon. General Omar Bradley sat alone in his office, reading the latest Venona decrypts. Bradley had been appointed Army Chief of Staff just weeks earlier. He was a soldier's soldier, methodical, cautious, deeply concerned about security. On his desk sat a classified memo from Army Intelligence. Recommendation: Venona briefing for President Truman. The memo laid out the arguments for telling the president. Truman was making policy decisions about Soviet espionage and communist infiltration. He was establishing loyalty programs. He was responding to FBI reports about spies. He should know that decoded Soviet cables proved the infiltration was real and extensive. Bradley read the memo 3 times. Then he picked up a red pen and wrote a single word across it: denied. But the decision haunted him. Bradley understood what withholding Venona meant. The president would receive warnings about Soviet spies, but never see the evidence that made those warnings undeniable. Truman would think the FBI was exaggerating. He would dismiss reports as politically motivated. He would make policy in the dark. But Bradley had concerns about the White House, serious concerns. Truman's staff included political operatives who leaked constantly to friendly reporters. Classified information appeared in newspapers with alarming regularity. Just 3 months earlier, a classified State Department memo about China policy had appeared in the Washington Post almost immediately after circulation. The leak had damaged diplomatic negotiations. It revealed American strategy to the Chinese communists. Truman had ordered an investigation. No one was ever caught. That same year, details about atomic weapons production appeared in a news article. The information was classified. Only senior officials had access. The leak came from somewhere in the executive branch. For Bradley, the calculation was simple and brutal. One leak about Venona, one careless comment to a journalist, one staff aide mentioning that America was reading Soviet cables. The Soviets would change their encryption systems within 24 hours. The intelligence stream would end. Years of painstaking cryptanalysis would be wasted. The single most valuable intelligence source of the Cold War would be gone. Bradley called in his senior intelligence officers. He told them his decision. They would send carefully paraphrased information to the White House. Truman would receive reports about Soviet espionage. He would get names of suspected agents. He would be informed about security threats. But he wouldn't know that American cryptanalysts were reading Soviet intelligence communications. He wouldn't understand that the evidence came from broken Soviet codes. An October 1949 FBI memo would later confirm the policy Bradley had established. The Venona intelligence will be shared with the White House on a need-to-know basis only. The president will not be informed of the code-breaking program. Bradley believed this was the right call. Protecting Venona was more important than presidential transparency. This wasn't insubordination. It was a soldier's calculation. But it meant looking the president in the eye during National Security Council briefings and knowingly withholding the full truth. A burden Bradley would carry alone for the rest of Truman's presidency. He accepted the consequence, a president who would receive the warnings but never see the proof that made them undeniable. The problem was that most of Hoover's warnings to Truman came through FBI channels, and Truman despised J. Edgar Hoover. It wasn't just distrust, it was visceral contempt. Truman had seen how Hoover operated. The FBI director cultivated relationships with conservative congressmen who opposed Truman's domestic policies. He leaked selectively to damage the president's political enemies. Most dangerously, Hoover collected derogatory information on politicians, judges, and journalists. He maintained secret files in his office. Everyone in Washington knew about the files. Everyone feared them. To Truman, Hoover represented everything he hated about unchecked bureaucratic power. A man who had made himself untouchable through blackmail and political alliances. So when Hoover brought reports of Soviet spies in government, Truman's first instinct was suspicion. Is this real intelligence, or is Hoover trying to pressure the administration toward more aggressive anti-communist policies? Truman's skepticism was reinforced by the quality of evidence in Hoover's reports. The FBI would name suspects, but the proof often seemed thin. Circumstantial associations, membership in left-wing organizations, attendance at Communist Party meetings in the 1930s. Truman demanded hard evidence before taking action. Proof of actual espionage, documents stolen, secrets passed, actual crimes committed, and Hoover couldn't provide that proof, at least not in a way Truman could see. Because the real proof was in Venona. The decoded Soviet cables that proved Hoover's suspects were actually Soviet agents. The cables that confirmed espionage was real and extensive. But Bradley had decided Truman couldn't know about Venona. So Hoover's reports looked like political witch hunting rather than legitimate counterintelligence. Truman dismissed warning after warning. He thought Hoover was exaggerating to increase FBI power and budget. He suspected the spy panic was manufactured for political purposes. And meanwhile, Soviet agents continued operating in American government because the president didn't believe the threat was real. August 3, 1948. House Un-American Activities Committee hearing room. A stocky, disheveled man named Whittaker Chambers sat at the witness table. He was nervous. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted the microphone, but his testimony was devastating. Chambers was a former Communist Party member who had defected from Soviet intelligence networks in 1938. For a decade, he had kept silent. Now he was ready to talk. He testified that Edgar Hoover, a former State Department official, had been a communist and Soviet agent in the 1930s. The accusations stunned Washington. Edgar Hoover was the epitome of the Eastern establishment. Harvard Law School, Supreme Court clerk for Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. Distinguished government service at the State Department. He had been at Roosevelt's side at Yalta. He had helped organize the United Nations. He was now president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Impeccable credentials. Unimpeachable reputation. When Chambers accused Hoover of espionage, the establishment rallied to his defense. Prominent Democrats vouched for his character. Liberal intellectuals dismissed Chambers as a mentally unstable ex-communist making wild accusations to get attention. Dean Acheson, who would soon become Secretary of State, publicly declared, "I will not turn my back on Edgar Hoover." On August 18, 1948, Truman held a press conference. A reporter asked about the Hoover investigation. Truman's response was dismissive and politically calculated. The public hearings on alleged communists in the government are a red herring. The Republicans are using spy accusations to distract from their lack of domestic policy ideas. A red herring. The President of the United States had just dismissed the most important espionage case of the early Cold War as political theater. The statement reflected Truman's genuine belief. He thought the spy panic was manufactured hysteria, Republican scare tactics to damage Democrats before the 1948 election. But in a secure facility in Arlington, Virginia, Army intelligence analysts were reading decoded Soviet cables that told a very different story. Multiple cables from 1945 referenced an agent with the code name Ailes. The cables described Ailes's position and activities in ways that matched only one person, Edgar Hoover. One cable from March 1945 reported that Ailes had traveled to Yalta with the American delegation. Another described his current position at the State Department. The evidence was conclusive, but it was locked in a top-secret file that the president would never see. Bradley knew Hoover was guilty. Senior Army intelligence officers knew. FBI counterintelligence knew. The president called it a red herring. February 2nd, 1950, Harwell, England. British intelligence arrested Klaus Fuchs at his home near the atomic research facility where he worked. Fuchs was a German-born physicist who had fled Nazi Germany in the 1930s. He had worked on the Manhattan Project at Los Alamos during the war. He was now a senior scientist in the British atomic program. He confessed immediately. He had been passing atomic secrets to Soviet intelligence since 1942. 8 years of espionage, detailed information about plutonium bomb design, American progress at every stage of development. The confession was devastating. It explained how the Soviet Union had detonated an atomic bomb in August 1949, years ahead of American estimates. Stalin hadn't achieved a scientific breakthrough. He had received American atomic secrets from spies inside the Manhattan Project. When Truman was briefed on the Fuchs arrest, he was shocked. The scale of atomic espionage was worse than anyone had publicly acknowledged. But what Truman didn't know was this. American intelligence had identified Fuchs as a Soviet agent years earlier through Venona. Decoded Soviet cables from 1944 referenced an agent codenamed Charles. The cables described him passing technical data about the atomic bomb. Army intelligence had monitored Fuchs for years, building a case through traditional investigation, waiting for a break that didn't require revealing the code breaking. By the time the arrest came in 1950, the Soviets already had the bomb. American atomic monopoly was gone. The evidence that could have stopped it earlier was locked in a safe at Arlington Hall, kept from the president who could have acted on it. Fuchs's arrest led to other arrests. He identified his American contact, a courier named Harry Gold. Gold identified David Greenglass, a machinist at Los Alamos. Greenglass identified his brother-in-law, Julius Rosenberg. The FBI rounded up an entire atomic espionage network. The evidence was overwhelming. Confessions, corroborating testimony, technical documents that matched what the Soviets had stolen. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were arrested in summer 1950. The government charged them with conspiracy to commit espionage. The trial began in March 1951. The prosecution's case was strong. David Greenglass testified that Julius had recruited him to spy. Harry Gold corroborated the testimony. Documents and technical sketches tied the network together. But the case had problems. Ethel's role was unclear. The evidence against her was thin, mostly her brother's testimony that she had typed classified documents. The Rosenbergs maintained their innocence. They claimed they were victims of anti-communist hysteria. Their supporters organized protests. Prominent intellectuals called for clemency. The jury convicted both Rosenbergs. Judge Irving Kaufman sentenced them to death. The sentence was controversial. No one had been executed for espionage in peacetime America. Appeals dragged on for 2 years. The Rosenbergs became a cause célèbre for the left. Global protests condemned American justice. Their execution in June 1953 divided the country. 2 young boys lost their parents. Protests erupted around the world. And the proof that would have silenced those protests sat in top-secret files. Inadmissible, invisible. Multiple decoded Soviet cables from 1944 and 1945 identified Julius Rosenberg by his code name Antenna. The cables described his recruitment of sources, his passing of classified information, his meetings with Soviet handlers, his role running a technical espionage network. The evidence was conclusive, but Venona couldn't be used at trial. Revealing it would compromise the code-breaking program. So the prosecution relied on witness testimony and circumstantial evidence, instead of the decoded cables that proved everything beyond any doubt. Truman left office in January 1953. 5 months before the Rosenbergs were executed. He never knew that decoded Soviet intelligence had confirmed their guilt with absolute certainty. February 9, 1950. McClure Hotel, Wheeling, West Virginia. Senator Joseph McCarthy stood before a Republican women's club, waving a piece of paper. "I have here in my hand a list of 205 names," McCarthy declared. Names that were made known to the Secretary of State as being members of the Communist Party, and who nevertheless are still working and shaping policy in the State Department. The accusation created a political firestorm. McCarthy's charges were reckless. He named innocent people. He ruined careers based on guilt by association. His evidence was often fabricated or exaggerated. He didn't have access to Venona, so he was throwing accusations without the proof that Bradley possessed. But his core claim, that Soviet infiltration had occurred, was accurate. The scale was exactly as serious as McCarthy claimed. Soviet intelligence really had penetrated the State Department. Communist agents really had stolen atomic secrets. The threat really was as dangerous as McCarthy said. He was right about the danger, but reckless with the facts. Truman despised McCarthy. The president saw him as a demagogue, exploiting fear for political gain. At a press conference, Truman publicly dismissed McCarthy's accusations as baseless witch hunting. The problem was that Truman didn't know McCarthy's basic claim was true. Soviet espionage really had been extensive. American government had been penetrated at high levels. Bradley knew this. He had read the Venona decrypts. He knew approximately 349 Americans had covert relationships with Soviet intelligence, but he couldn't tell Truman, and he certainly couldn't tell McCarthy. Revealing Venona would compromise the code-breaking program, so McCarthy made wild accusations without evidence. Truman dismissed those accusations as political theater, and Bradley sat in the Pentagon with decoded Soviet cables that proved the infiltration was real, unable to share them with anyone. The entire debate over communist infiltration became detached from reality. Neither side had access to the actual evidence. Both were operating on suspicion and political calculation rather than intelligence. If Truman had known about Venona, he could have pursued genuine Soviet agents while rejecting McCarthy's reckless methods. He could have separated real threats from political witch hunting. Instead, the president dismissed the entire issue as manufactured hysteria, because he didn't know that decoded Soviet cables proved the threat was real. January 20th, 1953. Dwight Eisenhower was inaugurated as President of the United States. Within weeks, Omar Bradley requested a private meeting with the new president. Bradley brought a locked briefcase to the Oval Office. Inside were Venona decrypts. He briefed Eisenhower on the entire program, the code breaking, the identified agents, the extent of Soviet penetration, and the decision to keep it secret from President Truman. Eisenhower listened without interrupting. He had been Supreme Allied Commander during World War II. He understood intelligence operations immediately. He grasped why Venona had to remain classified. He understood the security risks of wider distribution. But he also understood the problem Truman had faced, making Cold War policy without access to the most important intelligence about Soviet espionage. When Bradley finished, Eisenhower asked one question: "Does this need to stay secret?" Bradley nodded. "The Soviets still don't know we broke their codes. If it leaks, we lose everything." Eisenhower made the same decision Bradley had made. The Venona would remain restricted. The risk of leaks was still too great. The secret would continue for 42 more years. July 11th, 1995. The National Security Agency held a press conference in Fort Meade, Maryland. They announced the declassification of the Venona decrypts, nearly 3,000 decoded Soviet cables spanning 1940 to 1948. The release transformed historical understanding of the early Cold War. It confirmed that Soviet espionage had been massive and systematic. It proved that many accused spies really had been guilty. Alger Hiss was identified in multiple cables as Soviet agent Ailes. Julius Rosenberg appeared throughout the atomic espionage cables. Harry Dexter White, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, had passed information to Soviet intelligence. The cables vindicated those who had warned about Soviet infiltration. They proved the spy panic of the late 1940s had been based on real threats, not manufactured hysteria. But they also revealed something else. President Harry S. Truman had never been told that decoded Soviet cables confirmed everything Hoover had been warning him about. Truman died in 1972. He went to his grave believing he had been right to doubt Hoover's methods, never knowing that the hard evidence he had demanded existed all along. He had spent his presidency dismissing spy reports as exaggerated. He had publicly called the Hiss case a red herring. He had opposed aggressive counterintelligence measures, and the entire time, Army Chief of Staff Omar Bradley had possessed proof that the Soviet threat was exactly as serious as Truman's critics claimed. Bradley's decision created a permanent dilemma in intelligence operations. When does protecting sources become more important than informing the president? The arguments for his choice were rational. Venona was irreplaceable intelligence. One White House leak would have ended everything. The Soviets would have changed their encryption systems immediately. The arguments against were equally powerful. Truman was commander-in-chief making strategic decisions. His dismissal of spy reports affected policy. His public skepticism emboldened those who claimed the threat was manufactured. Bradley chose to protect the source rather than inform the commander-in-chief. Some paraphrased Venona information reached the White House, but declassified documents confirm Truman never learned the intelligence came from broken Soviet codes. The code-breaking program survived for decades. Truman made policy in partial darkness. He fought the right battles, containment, the Marshall Plan, NATO, without seeing the evidence that would have proved he was right. The lesson isn't that Bradley was wrong. The lesson is that every intelligence decision involves impossible trade-offs. Security versus transparency, protection versus information, short-term advantage versus long-term policy. Sometimes the military keeps secrets from the president, not from disloyalty, but from the calculation that protecting sources matters more than presidential knowledge. And sometimes that calculation leaves the president fighting enemies he can't quite see, with weapons he doesn't know he has. For 48 years, the Venona secret was kept, from presidents, from Congress, from the American people.